In the spring of 2009, every farmer in Tama County, Iowa, knew what you did when the energy company came knocking. You shook the man's hand, you read the check amount twice to make sure you hadn't misread it, and then you signed. This was not a decision. It was gravity. It was weather. It was the same as planting corn in May and harvesting in October. The sequence was fixed, the logic was unassailable, and anyone who suggested otherwise was either a fool or someone who hadn't yet seen the number on the check. Let me tell you about what that county looked like in the spring of 2009, because you need to understand the world before you can understand what Nora Tesdall did inside it. Tama County sits in the center of Iowa, flat and dark and rich, cut through by the Iowa River and a dozen smaller creeks that feed it. The soil there is deep black loam, some of the finest agricultural ground on the continent, built up over 10,000 years of prairie grass and glacial deposit. Farmers in Tama County didn't talk about their land the way people in cities talk about real estate. They talked about it the way people talk about family, with a particular combination of pride and anxiety and obligation that doesn't have a clean name in English. The Tesdall family had farmed 640 acres of that ground since 1931, when Nora's great-grandfather, a man named Clement Tesdall, had bought the northern parcel during the Depression at a price that would have seemed like theft, except that nobody else had the cash to buy it either. 3 generations had worked that ground since then. Nora's grandfather had added the southern 240 acres in 1958. Her father, a quiet, methodical man named Gerald Tesdall, had spent 40 years learning every low spot, every drainage problem, every stubborn clay lens that sat 18 inches down in the northeast corner and made that ground drain slow after a wet spring. Gerald Tesdall was not a complicated man. He planted corn and soybeans in a standard 2-year rotation, kept his equipment maintained, paid his bills on time, and averaged around 185 bushels of corn per acre on his best ground and 52 bushels of soybeans on the rest. He was not getting rich. Nobody in Tama County was getting rich in 2009. Corn was trading at $3.80 a bushel, beans at $9.40, and input costs had climbed every year for the better part of a decade. Gerald ran the numbers every February at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator that was older than his youngest daughter, and the numbers always came out approximately the same. Enough. Not comfortable, not secure. Enough. So when a man named Dale Prescott drove up the county road in a silver Ford F-25, in April of 2009 and turned into the Tesdall driveway, Gerald already knew what was in the briefcase. Prescott worked for a company called Meridian Resource Partners, a natural gas exploration firm that had been moving through central Iowa for 18 months, acquiring mineral rights leases from farm families along a corridor that tracked what their geologists believed was a productive formation about 2,400 feet down. Prescott was 58 years old, had been doing this work for 30 years, and had the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who couldn't eventually be talked into yes. He wore a canvas Carhartt jacket over a button-down shirt, which was a calculated choice, close enough to farm clothes to seem like one of them, clean enough to remind you he wasn't. He carried a leather briefcase and a smile that arrived slightly before the rest of his face. Gerald heard him out at the kitchen table. Prescott laid out the terms: a one-time signing bonus of $47,000, plus a royalty of 12.5% of any production revenue from the parcel. He had a map showing the formation, a stack of documents explaining the lease terms in language that required a lawyer to fully parse, and a list of neighboring farms that had already signed. 14 names that Gerald recognized, neighbors he'd known for decades. Prescott left the documents on the table and said he'd be back in a week. He shook Gerald's hand at the door and drove back down the county road. Gerald sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Prescott left. He looked at the number again. $47,000. That was more than a year's net income. That was the combine repair he'd been putting off for 2 seasons. That was the drainage tile project on the Northeast 40 that he'd been pricing for 3 years and never pulling the trigger on. He set the documents aside and went out to finish the afternoon's work, and that night he told his wife, a steady woman named Carol, that he was going to sign. Carol said she thought that was probably right. They agreed to call their daughter Nora before they made it final, because Nora had been asking questions about the farm's future, and it seemed like the kind of thing she should know about. Let me tell you about Nora Tesdahl, because she's the reason this story exists, and she's different from every other character this story might have been about. Nora was 23 years old in the spring of 2009. She had graduated the previous May from Iowa State University with a degree in agricultural and biosystems engineering, and she had spent the year since working a temporary position with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, reviewing permit applications for agricultural drainage projects. She was not a farmer yet. She had grown up on the farm, had driven tractors since she was 12, had helped with planting and harvest every year of her life. But she had been away for 4 years, and she had come back with something that nobody in Tama County had asked her to bring: a notebook full of questions. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru with an Iowa State parking sticker still on the rear window and a copy of a 2007 USGS groundwater study on the passenger seat that she had been reading on her lunch breaks for 6 weeks. She called her father the evening after Prescott's visit. Gerald explained the offer. Nora was quiet for a moment, then asked if he'd read the lease terms. Gerald said he'd look them over. Nora asked specifically about the surface use provisions, what the company was permitted to do on the land itself during exploration and drilling operations. Gerald said he wasn't sure. Nora asked about the indemnification clause, about the bonding requirements, about what happened to the lease if Meridian Resource Partners was sold or restructured. Gerald said he hadn't gotten that far. Nora asked if she could come home that weekend and look at the documents before he signed anything. Gerald said that was fine, but he didn't want to keep Prescott waiting too long. Nora said she understood. She drove home Friday evening. She sat at the same kitchen table where Prescott had laid out his briefcase, and she read every page of the lease document with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad of her own. It took her 4 hours. Carol brought her coffee twice. Gerald went to bed at 9 and got up at 6:30 and found Nora still at the table with the documents spread out and 3 pages of notes written in her precise, small handwriting. Let me tell you about what Nora found in those documents, because the details matter more than people want to admit when the number on the check is large enough to fill a year's worth of anxiety. The surface use provisions in Meridian's standard lease allowed the company to place equipment, access roads, and temporary structures on any portion of the leased parcel without prior approval from the landowner, subject only to a restoration requirement that was defined in language vague enough to be nearly meaningless. The bonding requirement, the financial guarantee the company was required to post to cover potential damages, was set at $25,000 per well site, which was a number that Nora had already learned from her work at the DNR bore no relationship to the actual cost of remediating a contaminated water supply. The indemnification clause required the landowner to hold the company harmless for damages to third parties arising from operations on the property. which meant that if something went wrong and a neighbor's water was affected, Gerald Tesdall could be named in the resulting lawsuit. And the royalty calculation used a definition of net revenue that included deductions for transportation, processing, and compression costs that could, in practice, reduce the effective royalty to something closer to 6 or 7%, rather than the 12.5% Prescott had quoted. But the thing that stopped Nora cold, the thing she circled 3 times with her highlighter and put a star next to in the margin, was a single paragraph on page 11 of the lease document. It was titled Water Rights Subordination, and what it said, in the careful language of legal drafting, was that by signing this lease, the landowner agreed that the mineral rights holder's use of subsurface water in connection with drilling and completion operations took precedence over the landowner's existing water rights for the duration of the lease and any extensions thereof. The Tesdall farm drew its water from a well that tapped the shallow alluvial aquifer at 85 feet. The same aquifer that supplied water to 11 other farms within a 2-mile radius. The same aquifer that sat, according to the USGS study on Nora's passenger seat, directly above the formation Meridian wanted to drill into. She sat with that paragraph for a long time. Then she got up and made herself coffee and sat back down and read it again. Then she went to her car and got the USGS study and opened it to the section she'd been reading on her lunch breaks. The section that described the hydrogeological relationship between the shallow alluvial aquifer in central Iowa and the deeper Devonian formation below it, and the documented cases in 3 other counties where drilling operations in the deeper formation had resulted in pressure changes that allowed formation water that had been trapped in the rock for millions of years, water that carried dissolved minerals and occasionally methane, and occasionally other things you didn't want in a drinking water supply, to migrate upward along the pathways created by drilling and casing failures. The study listed 7 documented cases. In 4 of them, the contamination had been detected within 18 months of initial drilling. In 2 of them, it had taken 3 years. In 1 of them, it had taken 6 years, and a family's well-going orange before anyone connected it to the drilling operation 1.5 miles away. When Gerald came downstairs at 6:30, Nora had her notes organized into 2 stacks. She walked him through everything she'd found. She didn't rush it, and she didn't dramatize it. She laid out the lease terms first, the ones that were unfavorable but negotiable, the surface use provisions, the bonding amount, the royalty calculation. Then she laid out the water rights subordination clause and explained what it meant. Then she put the USGS study on the table and explained what it said about the aquifer. Gerald listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he needed to think about it. Let me tell you about the science, because Nora's argument wasn't just legal caution, and it wasn't just fear. It was grounded in specific data that she had spent months accumulating, and the data told a story that the lease document was designed to prevent you from reading. The shallow alluvial aquifer in Tama County is what hydrogeologists call an unconfined aquifer. It sits close to the surface, it recharges relatively quickly from rainfall and snowmelt, and it has no impermeable cap rock separating it from the formations above and below. That's what makes it productive for farm wells. It's accessible and it replenishes. But that same openness that makes it useful also makes it vulnerable. When you drill through it to reach a deeper formation, you create a pathway that didn't exist before. If the well casing is perfect and the cement job is perfect and nothing ever shifts or corrodes, that pathway stays sealed. But well casings are not always perfect. Cement jobs are not always perfect. Things shift, things corrode. The USGS study Nora had been reading documented a failure rate for well casings in the Devonian Formation in Iowa of approximately 6.3% within the first 10 years of operation. That sounds small, but Meridian's permit applications, which Nora had reviewed at the DNR, indicated they intended to drill up to 40 wells along the corridor they were leasing. 6% of 40 is 2.5 wells. 2.5 wells leaking formation water into an unconfined aquifer that supplied drinking water to farms across a 4-township area was not a theoretical risk. It was a probability. Nora had also done the economic math, which is the part that surprised her father most. The $47,000 signing bonus, spread over the 20-year lease term, amounted to $2,350 per year. The royalty payments, based on the production estimates in Meridian's own permit documents and the effective royalty rate after deductions, would likely generate somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000 per year during peak production, declining thereafter. Total expected revenue over the lease term, somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000. The cost of remediating a contaminated farm well, according to DNR data Nora had pulled, ranged from $40,000 for a simple re-drilling to over $300,000 for cases requiring activated carbon filtration systems, ongoing water testing, and legal proceedings. The cost of losing the farm's water supply entirely, the scenario that had occurred in 2 of the 7 USGS cases, was not calculable in any simple way because a farm without water is not a farm. Gerald sat with all of this for 2 days. On Sunday evening, he told Nora he was going to decline Prescott's offer. He said it quietly, without ceremony, the way he made most decisions. He also said he wasn't sure it was the right call, and he wanted her to understand that. Nora said she understood. Carol, who had been listening from the doorway, said, "She's right, you know." Gerald looked at his wife for a moment and then nodded and went to finish the evening chores. Nora drafted a letter to Meridian Resource Partners on Monday morning, declining the lease offer. Gerald signed it. She mailed it that afternoon from the post office in Toledo. Let me tell you about what happened when Dale Prescott heard that the Tesdall farm had declined, because the reaction was not private and it was not quiet. Prescott had been working this corridor for 18 months. He had signed 41 leases. He had never had a farm family decline after a site visit. He drove back out to the Tesdall farm on a Tuesday morning, and Gerald met him at the gate, which was a thing Gerald almost never did. Gerald was a man who invited people to the kitchen table, not a man who stood at the gate. Prescott asked if there was a problem with the terms. Gerald said his daughter had reviewed the documents and they'd decided not to sign. Prescott asked if he could speak with Nora. Gerald said she wasn't there, which was true. Nora had gone back to her apartment in Ames. Prescott left a business card and said to have her call him. Nora did not call him. Prescott called her. She answered and listened while he explained that the concerns she'd raised were standard in the industry, and that Meridian had an excellent safety record, and that the bonding amount was consistent with state requirements. Nora said she was aware of what the state requirements were, and that she believed they were insufficient, and that the water rights subordination clause was not something her family was prepared to accept. Prescott said he'd seen a lot of young people come back to the farm with college ideas that didn't survive contact with the real world. Nora said she was sure he had. Prescott said the offer wouldn't stay on the table indefinitely. Nora said she understood that. Prescott said he hoped the family wouldn't regret it. Nora said she hoped so too. The word got around, the way words always get around in a county of that size. By the time Prescott had finished his circuit of the corridor, it was known at the co-op in Traer, and at the elevator in Dysart, and at the feed store on the south end of Toledo that Gerald Tesdall's daughter had talked him out of signing the Meridian lease. The reactions were varied. Some people said Gerald was a fool to leave that money on the table. Some people said it was his land and his business. A few people said they'd heard the girl had some kind of environmental concerns, which was a phrase delivered with a particular intonation that indicated the speaker considered environmental concerns to be roughly equivalent to believing in fairies. The man who said it loudest was a farmer named Buck Crowley. Let me tell you about Buck Crowley, because you need to understand what he represented in that community before you can understand what his opinion meant. Crowley farmed 1,100 acres in the southern part of Tama County, had served 2 terms on the County Farm Bureau Board, and was the kind of man whose opinion at the co-op counter carried the weight of accumulated social authority rather than any particular expertise. He was 61 years old, had signed his Meridian lease in the first wave in February, had received his $78,000 signing bonus. He had mentioned the number often enough that most people in the county knew it, and had subsequently become an informal advocate for the program, answering questions from neighbors who were still deciding. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made a decision and needed other people to make the same decision in order to feel fully confident in his own. Crowley held court at the co-op counter on a Thursday morning in May, 2 weeks after Nora's letter had gone out, with 4 other farmers present. He said that Gerald Tesdall had been talked out of $47,000 by a girl who'd been out of college for a year and thought she knew more about mineral rights than men who'd been farming this county for 40 years. He said the environmental concerns were nonsense, that Meridian had drilled 200 wells in Iowa without a single contamination incident, which was a number he had from Prescott and had not verified independently. He said that some people let their kids go to college and come back knowing everything, and that was fine, but the land didn't care about your degree. He laughed when he said it. It was the laugh of a man who has decided that certainty is more comfortable than doubt. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone laugh at a concern they haven't actually examined? Not a laugh of genuine amusement, but a laugh that's doing work, that's performing confidence for an audience, that's meant to make the concern seem small by making the person who raised it seem naive. That's the laugh Buck Crowley produced at the co-op counter in Traer, Iowa, in May of 2009. It was a laugh that was working very hard, and the thing about that kind of laugh is that it always tells you more about the laugher than about the thing being laughed at. Crowley wasn't laughing because Nora's concerns were obviously wrong. He was laughing because examining them carefully would have required him to wonder whether his own decision had been fully informed, and that was a line of thinking he was not prepared to follow. Nora heard about it secondhand, from a neighbor who called her father, who mentioned it to her the next time she was home. She didn't respond to it directly. She went back to her apartment in Ames and she kept working at the DNR and she kept reading. She had started pulling Meridian's permit applications more systematically, tracking the spacing of their proposed wells along the corridor, cross-referencing the locations with the aquifer mapping data in the USGS study, and building a spreadsheet that plotted the probability of casing failure events against the hydrogeological connectivity between each well location and the farms drawing water from the shallow aquifer above. It was the kind of work that nobody had asked her to do and nobody was paying her to do. She did it because the data was there and the question was real, and she was constitutionally incapable of leaving a real question unanswered. She also started talking to farmers, not in a formal way, She didn't hold meetings or distribute pamphlets. She called people her father knew, people whose numbers were in the old address book on the kitchen counter at home, and she asked them if they'd read their lease documents carefully before signing. Most of them said they had. When she asked specifically about the water rights subordination clause, most of them went quiet for a moment and said they'd have to look at that again. A few of them asked her to explain what she'd found. She explained it the same way she'd explained it to her father, carefully, without dramatics, with the specific page numbers and the specific data from the USGS study and the specific numbers from the DNR remediation cost database. 3 families in the northern part of the county had not yet signed. After talking to Nora, none of them did. Meridian Resource Partners began drilling operations in Tama County in the fall of 2010. The first wells went in on the southern end of the corridor, on land that included Buck Crowley's farm and 8 others. The drilling was unremarkable. The equipment arrived, the pads were prepared, the wells were drilled and cased and completed, and by the spring of 2011, there were 16 producing wells along the southern half of the corridor. Prescott sent royalty checks. Crowley cashed his and mentioned the amount at the co-op counter with some regularity. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't move fast and it doesn't announce itself, which is precisely what made it so hard to see coming and so impossible to ignore once it arrived. In 2011, the first year of production, the farms along the southern corridor received royalty payments averaging about $4,200 per farm. Crowley got $6,800, which was on the high end because his acreage was larger. The wells were producing, the checks were arriving, and the skeptics, the 3 families in the north who hadn't signed, the Tesdall farm, were the subject of occasional commentary at the co-op about money left on the table. Nora had left the DNR by then and moved back to Tama County. She had taken a position with the Iowa State University Extension Service, working out of the Tama County office on agricultural water quality issues. It was a modest job. The salary was $38,000 a year, and the office was a converted storefront on the main street in Toledo with a second-hand desk and a filing cabinet that didn't close properly. But it put her in the county full-time, and it gave her access to the county's water testing data, which the Extension Service compiled quarterly from voluntary submissions by farm families. She started reviewing that data the week she arrived. In the third quarter of 2012, she found the first anomaly. It was subtle. A slight elevation in dissolved methane in the well water of a farm called the Backer Place, about 1.5 miles south of the nearest Meridian well. The reading was 4.2 milligrams per liter. The EPA action level for dissolved methane in drinking water is 10 milligrams per liter. The Backer reading was below the action level, and the quarterly report noted it without flagging it as a concern. Nora flagged it. She called the Backer family, a husband and wife named Dirk and Lena, and asked if they'd noticed anything different about their water. Lena said it tasted a little different sometimes, kind of flat, but she'd figured it was the dry summer affecting the water table. Nora asked if she could come out and take an additional sample. Lena said of course. The sample Nora took tested at 5.1 milligrams per liter, still below the action level, but the trend was moving in one direction. Nora sent the results to the DNR with a note explaining the proximity to the Meridian wells and the hydrogeological context from the USGS study. The DNR acknowledged receipt and said they would monitor the situation. She also started testing more systematically. She contacted every farm within a 3-mile radius of the Meridian well field and asked them to submit water samples. 12 farms responded. She compiled the results in a spreadsheet and mapped them against the well locations and the aquifer connectivity data she'd been building since 2009. The pattern was not dramatic. It was not a smoking gun. It was a gradient. Slightly elevated methane readings that decreased with distance from the well field, consistent with what the USGS study described as the early signature of upward migration from a compromised well casing. She brought her data to the Tama County Extension Office Director, a man named Hal Jensen, and asked him to review it. Jensen looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then he said he didn't think they had enough data to make any formal claims and that she should continue monitoring. Nora said she agreed they didn't have enough data for formal claims, but she thought the pattern warranted notification of the affected farm families so they could make informed decisions about their water use. Jensen said he'd think about it. Nora said she was going to notify them regardless, in her capacity as an extension agent, and that she wanted him to know she was doing it. Jensen looked at her for a moment and then said that was her call to make. She sent letters to all 12 farms in October of 2012. The letters explained the data, explained what the readings meant, explained the action levels, and recommended that families with readings above 3 milligrams per liter consider using bottled water for drinking and cooking until the situation was better understood. 4 farms were above that threshold. The Backer place was one of them. 2 others were farms that had signed Meridian leases. The 4th was a farm that had declined. The letters caused a stir. 3 of the 4 affected families called Nora immediately. The 4th family, one of the Meridian lessers, called Prescott first. Prescott called Nora's office and told her that her letters were creating unnecessary alarm based on readings that were well within safe limits, and that she was potentially exposing the Extension Service to legal liability for interfering with a valid commercial operation. Nora said she was providing factual information to farm families about the quality of their drinking water, which was her job. Prescott said he'd be talking to her director. Nora said she expected he would. Prescott did talk to Jensen. Jensen called Nora into his office and told her that Prescott had raised concerns about the letters and that he'd received a call from Meridian's legal department. He said he needed her to understand that the Extension Service had to be careful about making claims that weren't fully supported by the data. Nora said she hadn't made any claims. She'd reported data and recommended precautionary measures that were consistent with EPA guidance. Jensen said that was a fine line. Nora said she knew it was. She also said that if the readings continued to rise and the Extension Service hadn't notified the affected families, the legal exposure would be considerably larger than whatever Meridian's lawyers were currently threatening. Jensen sat with that for a moment and then said she should continue monitoring. Buck Crowley heard about the letters. He drove to the Extension office in Toledo on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2012 and found Nora at her desk. He was not there to discuss the data. He was there to tell her that she was causing trouble in a community that didn't need it, that her readings were meaningless, and that she was embarrassing her father by running around telling people their water was poisoned when it wasn't. He said it, standing up, with his jacket still on, which meant he hadn't planned to stay long enough to take it off. Nora listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she turned her monitor toward him and showed him the spreadsheet. She showed him the gradient. She showed him the USGS study's description of what that gradient meant. She showed him the DNR's own database of remediation cases in Iowa, with the timeline from first anomalous reading to confirmed contamination event. She did not raise her voice. She did not tell him he'd made a mistake. She just showed him the data. Crowley looked at the screen for a long time. Then he said the readings were still within safe limits. Nora said they were, currently. Crowley said she was speculating. Nora said she was extrapolating from a documented trend, which was different. Crowley said he didn't see the difference. Nora said she understood. Crowley put his hat back on and left. His smile was still there when he walked out, but it had gotten smaller. Let me tell you about the spring of 2013, because that's when the story stopped being about data and started being about water. In March of 2013, the Backer family's well tested at 14.8 milligrams per liter of dissolved methane, above the EPA action level. Lena Backer called Nora the morning she got the result. Her voice was steady, but Nora could hear the thing underneath it. The thing that happens when a fact you've been hoping wasn't true turns out to be true. Nora told her to stop using the well for drinking and cooking immediately, to use bottled water, and that she was going to call the DNR that morning. She called the DNR before she'd finished her coffee. The DNR opened a formal investigation that afternoon. Over the next 6 weeks, the DNR tested 23 wells in the affected area. 11 of them showed methane readings above 5 milligrams per liter. 4 were above the EPA action level. The DNR's investigation identified what their report would later call a probable pathway of upward migration from a compromised section of casing on well 7 of the Meridian field, one of the 16 producing wells on the southern corridor. The casing failure was consistent with what the USGS study had described as the primary failure mode for wells drilled through the Devonian Formation in central Iowa. It had occurred, the DNR estimated, sometime in the late summer or early fall of 2012, approximately 14 months after the well had been completed. Meridian Resource Partners suspended operations on the affected wells and began remediation proceedings. The bonding they had posted, $25,000 per well site, the number Nora had flagged in the lease document 4 years earlier, was insufficient to cover the cost of the remediation by a factor of approximately 8. The DNR issued a consent order requiring Meridian to fund the full remediation from company resources. Meridian's legal department began a review of the lease agreements to determine the extent of the indemnification clauses, the clauses that required landowners to hold the company harmless for third-party damages. 3 families who had signed Meridian leases received letters from the company's attorneys informing them that they might be named as additional parties in any civil action arising from the contamination event, pursuant to the indemnification language on page 14 of their lease agreements. The Testall farms well tested clean. The 3 farms in the northern part of the county that had declined to sign after talking to Nora tested clean. The farms that had not been in the zone of hydrogeological connectivity to the compromised well also tested clean. The contamination was real, and it was bounded, and the boundary corresponded almost exactly to the gradient Nora had mapped in her spreadsheet in the fall of 2012. The news traveled through Tama County the way bad news always travels, faster than good news with more detail and less context. At the co-op in Traer, the conversations were different now. People who had been talking about money left on the table were talking about something else. People who had signed leases were reading their documents for the first time with the specific attention that fear produces. 3 families contacted lawyers. 2 of them found, on page 14 of their lease agreements, the indemnification clause that Nora had flagged in the spring of 2009. Nora was not triumphant about any of this. That's worth saying clearly, because the story could be told as a vindication narrative. Girl warns community ignores her, disaster proves her right. And while that's technically accurate, it misses the texture of what she actually felt, which was something closer to grief that she hadn't been more effective earlier. She'd gotten the data right. She had communicated it as clearly as she knew how. 4 families were still boiling their water. The fact that she had predicted it didn't make it better. She spent most of the spring of 2013 working with the DNR and the affected families on the remediation process. She helped 3 families navigate the process of filing claims against Meridian's bond. She attended 2 county supervisor meetings where the remediation timeline was discussed. She drove to the Backer farm twice a week for 6 weeks while the DNR was working through its investigation, bringing bottled water and sitting at the kitchen table with Dirk and Lena and answering questions as honestly as she could. Dirk asked her once, in a voice that was trying to be matter-of-fact and not quite making it, how long before they'd be able to use their well again. Nora said the DNR's estimate was 12 to 18 months for the methane levels to return to baseline after the casing failure was repaired, assuming no additional migration. Dirk nodded and looked at the table. Nora said she was sorry. Dirk said it wasn't her fault. Nora said she knew, but she was still sorry. Let me tell you about the morning Buck Crowley drove to the Tesdall farm, because it was a Tuesday in June of 2013, and Gerald was out in the planter and Nora was in the farm office, which was a corner of the machine shed with a folding table and an extension cord, working on a report for the extension service. She heard the truck on the gravel and looked up and recognized Crowley's pickup. She stood up and walked to the machine shed door. Crowley got out of the truck slowly, the way men get out of trucks when they're not sure of their welcome. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he'd worn to the extension office 7 months earlier. He did not have his hat on, which was different. He stood by the truck for a moment and looked at the ground and then looked at Nora. He said he wanted to talk. Nora said, "All right." They stood in the shade of the machine shed door, which was not quite an invitation inside, but was not a gate either. Crowley said he'd gotten a letter from Meridian's lawyers. He said his farm was in the indemnification zone, and that his attorney was telling him he might be looking at significant exposure depending on how the civil suit shook out. He said he needed to understand the hydrogeology better, so he could talk to his lawyer about the causation questions. He said he'd heard Nora had a detailed map of the aquifer connectivity. He said he was hoping she'd share it with him. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You told people at the co-op that I was a girl with college ideas who didn't know anything about mineral rights." Crowley said he remembered. Nora said, "You said the environmental concerns were nonsense." Crowley said he'd been wrong about that. He said it flatly, without ornamentation, which was the most honest thing she'd seen from him. Nora said she appreciated him saying so. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll show you what I have." She spent 2 hours with him at the folding table in the machine shed office. She walked him through the aquifer map, the USGS data, the gradient readings from 2012, the DNR's causation analysis, and the specific hydrogeological pathway the investigators had identified between Well 7 and the affected farm wells. She explained the indemnification clause and what it meant legally. She gave him copies of everything she had that was in the public record. She did not tell him he should have listened in 2009. She did not need to. The data said it clearly enough. When Crowley left, he shook her hand at the truck. His grip was different than she imagined it would have been in 2009. Not the grip of a man performing confidence, but the grip of a man who has been reduced to his actual size and is trying to figure out what to do with it. He said he appreciated her time. Nora said of course. He drove back down the county road. Gerald came in from the field at noon and found Nora making sandwiches. He asked whose truck that had been. She told him. Gerald was quiet for a moment, cutting his sandwich in half with the precision of a man who does everything the same way every time. Then he said, "What did he want?" Nora said he needed help understanding the Aquifer data for his lawyer. Gerald said, "And you helped him." Nora said she had. Gerald nodded and picked up his sandwich. He said, "That was the right thing to do." He said it in the same tone he used to say everything, level without decoration. But Nora had grown up listening to her father's voice, and she could hear what was in it, and what was in it was not complicated. Let me tell you about what happened in Tama County over the following years, because the story doesn't end with a remediation order and a handshake in a machine shed. The DNR's investigation concluded in September of 2013 with a formal finding of casing failure on Well 7 and a consent decree requiring Meridian to fund full remediation of all affected wells, provide alternative water supplies to the 4 families with above action level readings, and conduct quarterly testing of all wells within the affected zone for 5 years. The total remediation cost was $2.3 million. Meridian's bonding covered $400,000 of it. The remainder came from company resources, which were sufficient. Meridian was a solvent company. But the process took 3 years of legal proceedings and 1 civil suit that settled in 2015 for an undisclosed amount. The Backer family's well returned to baseline methane levels in November of 2014, 16 months after the casing repair. Dirk called Nora when he got the test result. He said they'd run the tap for a while before they trusted it, but it tasted right. Nora said she was glad. He said he was too. He said he thought they owed her something, and she said they didn't owe her anything. He said he disagreed. She said she hoped his next harvest was good. He said the same to her. The 3 families in the northern part of the county who had declined to sign after talking to Nora in 2009 had, by 2013, become something of an informal reference point in the county. People knew their names and knew why they hadn't signed and knew that their wells had tested clean throughout the contamination event. 2 of those families had daughters in high school who were interested in agricultural science. One of them came to Nora and asked about studying at Iowa State. Nora spent an afternoon with her talking about the program, about what courses mattered, about the USGS study, and how she'd found it. The girl enrolled the following fall. Nora presented her aquifer connectivity research at the Iowa State University Extension Annual Conference in 2014. It was a technical presentation, 45 minutes, slides, data tables, and it was attended by extension agents and DNR staff and a handful of university researchers who were working on related questions. At the end of the presentation, a professor from the ISU Geology Department named Dr. Anita Sorensen, who had been working on aquifer vulnerability mapping for 15 years, came up to Nora afterward and said that the methodology Nora had used to map the hydrogeological connectivity was something she'd been trying to get funding to develop formally, and asked if Nora would be interested in collaborating on a paper. Nora said she would. The paper was published in the Journal of Environmental Quality in 2016. It was cited 14 times in the first 2 years, mostly by state environmental agencies in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska that were developing or revising their mineral rights leasing guidelines. The Iowa DNR used the aquifer connectivity mapping methodology in a revised set of drilling permit requirements that went into effect in 2017. The new requirements mandated higher bonding amounts, more stringent casing specifications, and mandatory pre-drilling aquifer baseline testing for all wells within 2 miles of an unconfined aquifer. They also required that all mineral rights leases in Iowa include a plain language summary of the water rights subordination provisions, written at an 8th grade reading level, that had to be signed separately from the main lease document. Nora was 30 years old when the new requirements went into effect. She was still working out of the Tama County Extension office, still at the second-hand desk, though the filing cabinet had been replaced. She had also, by then, taken over management of 320 acres of the Tesdall farm from her father, who had begun stepping back from the day-to-day operation. She ran a diversified rotation: corn, soybeans, and oats, with a cover crop mix in the off-season, and had started a small plot trial comparing conventional tillage to strip till on the clay-heavy Northeast 40 that her father had been trying to drain properly for 30 years. The trial was in its second year, and the preliminary data was interesting. Buck Crowley's civil exposure from the Meridian contamination event had been resolved in the 2015 settlement, which had cost him something he never disclosed publicly, but which his attorney had described to him as significant. He had not renewed the Meridian lease when it came up for extension in 2019. Meridian had restructured by then anyway, and the new company that acquired the Iowa assets had renegotiated most of the corridor leases under substantially revised terms that included higher bonding, better surface use provisions, and the plain language water rights summary that the DNR now required. Crowley had attended one of the informational meetings the DNR held in 2017 about the new requirements. Nora had been one of the presenters. He had sat in the third row and listened without saying anything, which was different from how he usually sat in rooms. Gerald Tesdall retired from full-time farming in 2018. At the retirement party his neighbors organized at the Tama County Fairgrounds, a potluck in the 4-H building with folding tables and a sheet cake and about 60 people. Gerald's neighbor from the north section, a man named Ernie Johansson, who had farmed next to the Tesdalls for 30 years, stood up and said something that Gerald would repeat to Nora later that evening on the drive home. Johansson said that in 30 years of neighboring with Gerald, he'd never known him to make a decision that wasn't careful and considered and aimed at the long term. He said that the most careful and considered decision Gerald had ever made was listening to his daughter in the spring of 2009 when she sat at his kitchen table and read a lease document that 41 other families in the county had signed without reading. Gerald told Nora what Johansson had said as they were driving home on the county road, the headlights picking up the edge of the corn in the dark. Nora said Johansson was being generous. Gerald said he didn't think so. He said he thought Johansson was being accurate. He said it in the same level, undecorated tone he used for everything, and Nora drove the rest of the way home without saying anything because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a shape that only becomes clear from the far end. In the summer of 2021, Nora's daughter, a 10-year-old named Clara, who had her grandmother Carol's eyes and her mother's habit of asking questions that adults found inconvenient, came home from school with a project about local history. She had chosen to write about the Meridian contamination case, which she had found in the DNR's public records database because her teacher had shown the class how to use it. She had printed out 17 pages of documents and organized them in a folder with tabs. She showed the folder to Nora at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table, and asked if she could interview her for the project. Nora said of course. Clara asked her questions for 45 minutes, reading them from a list she'd written in a spiral notebook. When she was done, she closed the notebook and looked at her mother and said, "Did you know you were right when you didn't sign?" Nora thought about it for a moment. She said she had thought the data pointed in one direction, but she hadn't known. She said there's a difference between thinking the data points somewhere and knowing where it leads. Clara thought about that. Then she said, "But you acted like you knew." Nora said that was because when the data is clear enough and the stakes are high enough, the difference between thinking and knowing stops mattering. Clara wrote that down in her notebook. The Tesdell Farm's well has been tested annually since 2012. Every result has come back clean. The aquifer that sits 85 feet below the northeast corner of that farm, the same aquifer that Clement Tesdall drew water from in 1931 when he bought the land during the Depression, is the same aquifer that supplies water to the farm today. The USGS study that Nora read on her lunch breaks at the DNR in 2009 is still in the farm office, in a manila folder in the filing cabinet next to her desk. The pages are marked up with yellow highlighter and pencil notes in her precise, small handwriting. She keeps it there not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the most important documents are usually the ones nobody else has read carefully yet. Nora Tesdall planted her family's farm in a county that told her to sell. The company drilled. The casing failed. The water turned. And the well that nobody wanted to protect was the only one that stayed clean.